Great to have you join us on TVC Breakfast. You're welcome.
And we're streaming live on YouTube, and you can connect with us on Twitter using the hashtag TVC Breakfast.
Right, let's begin with the news now. Just reaching us, former President of Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe, has died at the age of 95.
It was the founding father of Zimbabwe who ruled the country for more than 3 decades. Before his death, he spent months in the hospital in Singapore earlier this year, and details of his ailment were kept secret.
Now, Mugabe was deposed in a coup in 2017 when members of his own party turned against him after he dismissed then Vice President Emmerson Mnangagwa to make way for his wife, Grace. Excuse me. His death was announced by President Emmerson Mnangagwa on Twitter. All right, we have policy analyst now, Dayo Lomuagun, with us here in the studio. It's nice to have you join us, right? Thank you very much. We also have a lawyer and public affairs analyst, Gani Fani, joining us here in the studio. Thank you so much. All right. Now, let me start with you, Gani. I know that you have been, you have followed the life and times of former President Robert Mugabe, even in the 80s when he led the country and became Prime Minister and then became President and all of that. How would you describe him generally? The controversy around him, everything around him being the father of the country, the father of the nation, the father of the continent, and so on. Talk to us.
The man was like, if I would describe, elephantine in his time. Because you know what the elephant symbolizes. He was a man of several parts. And when we were growing up, when the struggle was going on with his ZANU-PF, taking up of arms, we admired him quite a lot. He did quite a lot for his country, a patriotic man. But his life has also taught me a lesson about Africa generally, about sit-tight leaders. He became the president, and I think what he could have done was what Mandela did. But he stayed put in power for too long, to the extent that when you talk of power corrupts, absolute power corrupts, now set in. And then it became a kind of a disaster. It's very unfortunate. Because if he had lived, if he had left office early enough, perhaps it would have been a shining example to other African leaders. But unfortunately, all the African leaders were almost trying to copy him by staying put in power, and then you now have what you call diminishing returns. Leaders now going for things that are not even ennobling enough, things that don't promote their nationals and all that. Unfortunately, they say death is a necessary end that will come when it will come. Now it has come. It means nobody lives forever. We wish him his soul in perfect, at least to rest in perfect peace.
All right, but Dayo, looking at the legacies that Robert Mugabe has laid down for Zimbabweans, what would you say should be the take-home for Zimbabweans when they remember their founding father?
I think, I mean, like you just mentioned, you cannot take that away from Mugabe. He remained a great man, even in that. Forget whatever atrocity he's done. I think he did so much for his country in the wake of trying to get independence, and even after they became independent. And but you see, it's a miss. It's a miss of, I mean, exactly. So now that he's dead, it's unfortunate. I mean, the story of Mugabe is really unfortunate. It's somebody that will have remained a great man by every standard. You know, having to take Rhodesia, then Zimbabwe, from that, taking them to a point where you see, it was like the Nkrumah of Ghana. You know this guy has ambitions for his people. Everything was about the African man. Everything was about taking Africa from his countrymen from poverty, setting them on standard. But at a point, like you mentioned, the absolute power came in and it became so corrupt that you are hijacking, taking farms from the white guys, and you are giving it to your cronies, you're giving it to your guys. So at a point, he shifted, and that was the challenge he had. And later you stay put to power and say until God calls you home, and eventually, he's dead. So for me, for an average Zimbabwean, I think whenever they remember Mugabe, I think they should be proud that he was an African, he was one of them, and also again, in the mind, I think they also feel sorry that this guy who have made a difference, he could have made a difference for generations to come. But alas, he didn't do that. And I feel now the war to rebuild Zimbabwe. I think at the end of the day, Mugabe left Zimbabwe, if you allow me to say, maybe worse than he met it.
Wow.
But
okay.
No,
let's read what the president of South Africa tweeted to announce the death of Mugabe. President Emmerson Mnangagwa of Zimbabwe said, "It is with utmost sadness that I announce the passing on of Zimbabwe's founding father and former president, Comrade Robert Mugabe." And he went on to say he was an icon of liberation, a Pan-Africanist who dedicated his life to the emancipation and empowerment of his people. That was a tweet from the president of Zimbabwe, Emmerson Mnangagwa. Now, Gani, let me come to you on this. The point there is, when we're looking at Mugabe, can we classify him in the caliber of leaders like Robert Mugabe, Julius Nyerere, Kwame Nkrumah, and the others?
To some extent, yes. As I said earlier on, but what pains me most that as I still continue to emphasize, he was a tragic hero. A man who set out well. A man who meant well for his people. Almost laid down his life fighting for them. But when you see in the process of his trying to remain in power at all costs, he now decided to compromise. And things now seem to be taking the negative, as if, in actual fact, all his very good intentions were actually not genuine. And that is because of the fact that power, if you stay too long on power, you continue to now have the opposite of it. Because there's something in power like a spirit. Yes, it catches you, and leaders that are patriotic must know it and leave the stage when the ovation is loudest, which unfortunately he did not. And that's why I classify him as a tragic hero. That it was very obvious.
Okay. Now, when it comes to the issue of the days that Robert Mugabe was president, he took some very drastic policies in this country that a lot of people said, well, he's a nationalist and he's thinking of his people, but others felt, well, no country is an island and all of that, especially when it comes to the issue of land. Land was one of the very significant issues in Zimbabwe. How would you react to that?
Yes, again, you see, I think neither here nor there. If you remember that Zimbabwe is an agrarian economy, I mean, most of the money was coming from agriculture. Now, if you look at the history where majority of the land, the good lands, were owned by the white guys there. Now, you cannot give an independence to a people and you leave them to poverty. So maybe in a way, Mugabe meant good for the people. So you cannot say you're independent now and the poor people all around, they are still the black and there's nothing that could be done.
A lot of people saw him as that nationalist to think of his people, but the tactic and the strategy, a lot of people saw him as racist.
Yes, along the line, I think he didn't manage it properly. Again, like you said, you can't be an island in the midst of the whole country, I mean, the other countries of the world. So you have a relationship. At the end of the day, by the time you make your agricultural produce, you're still exporting them out. And that is, at the end, because he didn't manage the process very well, Zimbabwe end up going into hunger. The country that has hitherto been exporting food, the whole world has to come to support Zimbabwe to feed. And so I think it's good that it's a nationalist. You are looking at how the people can benefit. But the sad thing about it again is at the end of the day, whatever is taken from the white, you are not giving it to the people ultimately. You're giving it to the guys around you. And that is the sad thing, the sad story about him. So in trying to do that, there's nothing wrong about empowering your people, which you'll be down. It was the same thing Nelson Mandela was campaigning for in South Africa. It was the same thing Nkrumah was. So there's nothing really wrong about it, but it is the how. It's
The
this
how
process
matters, the how.
that was the issue with Mugabe.
Now, looking at the reactions, that have come based on his death on Twitter, especially, you see mixed reactions, and you see a disconnect. The younger generation seems to not have the sense of allegiance, or some sense of
A bond.
to Robert Mugabe, because he ruled for 37 years. A lot of them only knew Robert Mugabe in power until he was ousted. But what would you say is the problem? How should African leaders be able to connect the younger generation to history, and so that the younger generation is not disconnected with what the founding fathers had done to liberate the nation?
History is very, very important. Anybody, any race, any nation that has no history has no future. So we have to take history very seriously. And there's no way you want to know what happened in the past other than it's being relayed to you through oral tradition and some other methods. For you to know what happened in the past other than it's being relayed to you through oral tradition and some other methods. Fortunately, these days, this is the age of literacy, that we could write and read. So it is a policy of government that is not only in Zimbabwe that this is happening. I've had people that ask, right on the street of Ibadan, I said, Adekunle Ajuyi, a former governor, he said he only knew of Adekunle Gold. It was as bad as that. So we as leaders, we as a government, we as a people must take history very seriously and ensure that the younger ones will have something to lay their foundation on and be able to know that, yes, because one day they will also become adults. Right. They become presidents. And these are the things they will see as a role model. I want to be like this, I want to be like that. So it is not the fault of the younger ones. If what they only hear is that, oh, this man was taking land and giving it to his cronies and so on and so forth. That was a man that was in the bush fighting. You hardly find somebody like that when we were in the university and all that. It was being celebrated all over the place.
History has told us that Robert Mugabe was regarded as an icon of liberation, even as described by President Emerson Mnangagwa. Talk to us about what we should remember. We know that he turned sour at the end of his life as then president of Zimbabwe. But talk to us about the good times that Robert Mugabe lived as president in Zimbabwe.
Certainly, former President Mugabe will be remembered for his patriotism, for his courage to struggle and liberate his people. It is quite uncommon because he took up arms to liberate his people from oppression and from bondage. And he was also lucky to also benefit, because it is not just fighting alone. You are also now at the reins of power. So he also got that one. But unfortunately, his hubris, so to speak, was his Achilles heel. Because why not for that, nobody today would have had any question mark on whatever former President Mugabe was. And nevertheless, like the elephant that he was, his parts must be many, both the sour as well as the one that is sweet and the rest. He will still be remembered as a patriotic man, as I said, that fought for his people.
All right. Let me bring it to you, Dio. When it comes to his life in politics, we saw how he was a revolutionist, he was a Marxist. In fact, at the time he was coming up with with his own ideology, people called him the Mugabeist. And they started creating the Mugabism, as the case may be. But if we talk about his days in the ZANU and then led to ZANU-PF and his role as the chairman of African Union, African Organization of African Union, OAU at the time, and chairman of the African Union, his role on the African continent in that regard, how would you describe him as a man, a political man, or a political leader?
I think Mugabe he remains a great political icon. And if you look at the struggle from the point where he arrived from Ghana and he went into jail for 10 years and then he's coming out, and it's the life of struggle that he started. You see the genuineness in this man and say, it's about the liberation of the people. I mean, for you to spend about 10 years in jail.
10 years in jail.
A lot.
And then he was in exile in Mozambique and other countries.
You know, and he knew where he was going. He knew what was good for the people. Even right in the jail, he got about 3 degrees. And these are the things that helped him as he was going. So he was just a great man that he meant well for Africa. Again, it is about this African spirit, that whether for his people, whether at the Africa Organization, African Unity level, you know, or AU level, the African spirit was there that, look, Africans cannot be left this behind. Africa must rise to take their places, you know. But at the end of the day, again, if you look at some of his political belief, I mean, philosophy, I think it was unfortunate because at a point, that philosophy expired, and Mugabe began to run against the tide.
But,
now,
I wonder what really changed, because if it has to do with someone who understood the African continent, he was one of those. If it has to do with someone who feels the pain of Africans and want to change things, he is one of them. If it is someone who has traveled across the length and breadth of this world and understands the different thinking and where he wants to, take Africa to, he is one of those. And he had led, a good government. And then in 2000, where he came with the land redistribution and all of that, what do you think really changed at that point that twisted him from that nationalist to what
So I think at that point, people begin to feel Mugabe has become a selfish about whatever policy is pushing. Right. And I think at that point, it's just like running against the tide. Now, the civilization we're going through has embraced democracy. I mean, whatever your definition of democracy, we have embraced democracy, and democracy is usually, capitalism is almost synonymous to democracy. But this is a Mugabe that still feel it's about Africa. It's about Zimbabwe. If you're white, you are a problem. If you're having land, as a white, you are a problem. And it's not about that. So the Marxist theory that he was part of, that he believes so much in, cannot begin to work at this level. Now, at that point, you need more of diplomacy, more of negotiation, which Mugabe, I'm not sure he was ready to do. So it was like putting himself against the tide, like I said, and it was unfortunate for him. Apart from maybe at the point he became selfish, he became too power drunk and all that. The policy he was driving also was not popular at the point.
It was counterproductive.
But Ganifani, looking at how it turned out at the end of the day, how did this affect the politics in Zimbabwe and the economy of Zimbabwe?
Of course, it is obvious that in the end, virtually everything collapsed. Zimbabwe, that used to export food, now became a country that you now have to import food. So how will you call that one? So it is actually an unfortunate development. And that's why I describe him as a tragic hero. When you meant well, and then there is the Achilles heel that is there following the leader, the hubris, the confidence. Once they play against you, it is there in theory that power corrupts, absolute power corrupts. You have to be very careful with power. It is a spirit. It is an intoxicant. If you take it, so many things around you, they will feel that you are no longer a human being. When in actual fact, like it has now come, nobody can live forever.
It's inevitable.
It's inevitable. So it is rather very unfortunate because to get persons like Mugabe is not very easy. What he went through and what he was able to achieve within his lifetime is what you hardly come about, which is part of the problem that most of the African nations are having, because there is no preparation for leadership. If you don't undergo those kind of problems, kind of tests, type of tribulations, you can't be a leader. So that is why it became unfortunate, because of the reason that the fact that he stayed too long with the reins of power. Otherwise, today, He would have been a model for the rest of Africa.
All right. Well, Dio, Mugabe was someone who talked about projected Africanism and being nationalistic and all of that. Now, he also talked about the issue of the Western type of democracy not recommended for Africa. And he was coming up with his own, style and all of that. But if we have to look inwardly and look at the kind of democracy that is being practiced in the West and the kind of one that Africans really want, should they be different? Should we have our homegrown kind of democracy, or it should be a 4-4-year or 5-5-year or 10-year democracy?
Again, I said, I mean, the democracy, I just mentioned that the democracy, depending on what your definition of democracy is. And it's unfortunate that, again, this influence of the West on Africans. Now, a democracy that you just adopted a couple of decades ago, you don't force it on Africa here. Now, before colonization, I mean, we have African countries, even in Nigeria, you have cities and, towns that
we had
there,
kings and chiefdoms and
they
had their own democracy within the system.
Exactly. Since 9th century, 14th century, towns and communities have been here and they are governing themselves and they were developing at their own pace. So to come and rubbish all of that and destroy a people and destroy their culture and destroy their tradition and now foster whatever you call as democracy on them is not fair. And what have we achieved with that democracy, even as Nigeria or even as Africa as a whole? So clearly, this democracy, you see that this template we call democracy is not working for us in Africa or the way Africans are playing it. Now, if maybe at a point, Africans should be thinking of having their own version of democracy that suits their culture, that suits their orientation, that suits everything.
But haven't you had it before? Before colonialism, just like you said.
Yes.
Would there be anything new? Because when you're talking about, okay, Africa should look at way of fashioning out their own kind of democracy. Would there be anything new from the kind of people we are before, where we submit to a king or a chiefdom or a chief or something?
And in fairness, and I asked myself, what exactly was wrong with that?
Okay.
You see, what exactly was wrong with the monarchical system of government we have in most of these places, or the emirate and all that? Now, it is not. It is ultimately, governance is about how the people benefit. So clearly what we are taking from this democracy is not the best. Now, I'm not very old, but if you ask the older people, older generation, people in their 100, in their 70, in their 60, they will tell you that it was even a lot better those days. Now, the amenities we're struggling to get, it was because those days, the king is there, and the benefit goes to the people. You hardly see people who want to announce, as you are going to government this day. I mean, you take your country, for example. I just told you, I mean, a senator earning worth just 1 month's salary is enough to pay what another worker will earn for 40 years. That is bizarre. So what I'm saying is, those days, they have, you may say there are a few abuses here and there, or how can the king has overall control over everything. Now, if you check those abuses, I think what we had in the days of our father is a lot better than this. And I think that was the orientation the early politicians, the early nationalists had. And you see that between the 50s and the 70s, you have the development and all that going on in Nigeria. Not like this kind of one-man take-it-all that we have. This system, whatever you call it, whether it's democracy or democracy, is not
the
sustainable.
Western kind of democracy.
It's not sustainable for us, and we need to change something.
Okay, but Gani, if you look at, from what he has said, looking at the flaws of democracy, Western democracy as it is, do you think with the level of education that African countries have gone through, is it possible that African countries can actually carve out their own form of democracy or form of governance?
Very unfortunate at the level at which we are. We have to tell ourselves the truth. It's a fait accompli.
Why is that?
Fait accompli that we have accepted this system of governance and we have to advance in it. But rather, very unfortunately, as of today, as a lawyer, if you take anybody into the box as a witness and you ask him that your name may be a prefix of Ogun, god of iron, and say, okay, because your name is Ogun, please go and bring cutlass. whatever you are going to say in this court. He said, no, I'm a Christian. I'm a Muslim. This and that. So something is still there that I know.
Okay.
Which is different. He said, come and do this. And besides that, we had empires here that the whites actually acknowledged. Take, for instance, the Oyo Empire. All these...
the Bini Empire.
The Bini Empire, the great empire.
The Kanem Borno Empire.
Yes, and they acknowledged it as very, very successful. There was no powerful as the kings were when they say in Oyo Empire and they say the Oba to go and Shigba, go and open the something. That Oba is going to commit suicide.
The Calabash.
Yes, because there is what we call the Oyomesi. So it was not as if it was an absolute power.
There were checks and balances.
Exactly,
Right.
and they acknowledged when they came. But unfortunately, when a custom appears or a language appears to be superior to the other one, like your children now go to the nursery school and all that. If your child comes home and starts to speak your dialect, after all, I spent so much money on you. Why are you still speaking this kind of a thing? So which ordinarily should not be so.
All right.
It has been practiced even when I was at Ife, that our mother tongue was being used to teach. There's nothing. This English I'm speaking as I'm talking now, it is from my mother tongue. I first of all think before I talk, which was the reason why Shoyinka's work was being translated by late Akinwumi Ishola. He said, I would translate the autobiography, one of the great works of Shoyinka, to his mother tongue, because he first of all taught in his mother tongue before he went ahead. So these are revolutions that are expected from an environment that is not like what we are having now, when you are looking for what to eat. Or when you are looking for, and when we are having security, survival, you won't be able to think properly. So these are the things that I believe that with the environment that we have, we make it suitable for us and for the generations that are coming to be able to benefit better than us. Unlike what I am now seeing, because I benefited than the people that are now seem to be being born right now.
Okay. Dio, if we look at the metamorphosis, if I have to use that, of Zimbabwe from Rhodesia to Zimbabwe and then going on into the time where Emerson Mnangagwa came on, it has been kind of very dramatic. But if we focus on how Zimbabweans benefited, especially when you come to the rating of an average Zimbabwean under Mugabe, where at the time they were rated as the most educated Africans in that sense. How has things been between that time and now? How would you rate it?
I think if you ask an average Zimbabwean, today, I'm not sure they are happy about the situation in Zimbabwe. Whether and you see, even during the reign of Mugabe, a couple of policies he did actually caused pain to the Zimbabweans, like this operation, something other, that he did, where almost about 700,000 people were left homeless. So if you look at some of his policies, they were so draconian, they were so anti-people, that even an average Zimbabwean would not be happy. Was not happy. And if you look at the end of the day, the economy came part of the people, everything in shambles. I think they don't press him.
Let's have somebody else join us via Skype now. Colin Sinweke, who is Global Affairs Analyst. Thank you so much for joining us. He's joining us from Belgium. Looking at what the development that we've seen this morning, Robert Mugabe dies at 95, and he's been described as an icon of liberation. What are your thoughts? What would be your thoughts about this great man that died?
Robert Mugabe indeed was an icon of liberation, a pan-Africanist who did very much for his people and actually placed Africa one way or the other on the global map in terms of, fighting out for Africans. Unfortunately, he became a hero who didn't know when to exit when the ovation was still high. That, however, does not subtract from the very wonderful work he did for Zimbabwe and for Pan-Africanism. And I believe that he will be remembered both on the bad side and on the good side. But in my culture, there is this saying that when a man dies, you praise the man for the good things that he did, and then regret the fact that he didn't have the opportunity to make amends for the things that he did less good.
But if you look at the contributions of Robert Mugabe to the development of Zimbabwe, how would you regard, what's the difference between what Robert Mugabe did at that time and what Emmerson Mnangagwa is doing now?
Well, Mnangagwa is actually trying to clean up the mess that Robert Mugabe's stubbornness actually created. Robert Mugabe started on a very, very fantastic foundation, built up his country, but he became greedy for power, greedy for retaining power. And in the course of that greediness, he meted out untold hardship to the people of Mugabe, to that beautiful country. And that happened over decades, over a long period of time. I believe that the current president is actually battling as much as he could to clean up all of those mess. So I think the world needs to be a little bit kind and patient with the current president, because the mess that he is cleaning up wasn't one that he directly created, even though he was part of that dispensation.
Exactly. If I have to stay with you, Collins, on this, Emmerson Mnangagwa, who has been nicknamed the Crocodile, was one of those, the strong men of Zimbabwe, of Robert Mugabe, who actually carried, in fact, he was the foot soldier, the #1 foot soldier for Robert Mugabe. All what we described Mugabe as doing were actually carried out, or said to be carried out by Emmerson Mnangagwa. If we have to look at things from the perspective, in fact, you recall that when he became the head of government in Zimbabwe, there were a lot of protests in the streets saying that he was just a continuation of the regime of Mugabe. So what would you see is the difference between Mnangagwa and whatever Mugabe stood for?
Yeah, I recall, Mike, that you and I had a conversation on this program when Mnangagwa was sworn in, and I recall that